The Republic of the United States of the Seven Netherlands had been fighting a war against the Spanish realm for 40 years, but both parties were at a breaking point. Neither of them had money to continue the war, but the peace negotiations were doomed. Spain demanded that the Republic give up the East India trade, reinstate the Roman Catholic religion, and would never consider the United States independent. England and France felt the same way, as both were uncomfortable having a people-led republic next door and preferred to have their own trading companies. The Republic and Spain refused to compromise on any points, and in the end, both parties agreed to a 12-year truce. King Felipe III of Spain had more or less declared the Republic independent, allowed them to trade in the East Indies, and left the states control over their religion, Calvinism. All the Republic had promised was that they wouldn't create the West India Company and wouldn't attack the Portuguese in the East Indies. The war was paused, but there were plenty of other problems ahead. The Holy Inquisition had kept Spain pretty much Protestant-free, but there were still Jews and Moriscos, the descendants of Moors who had conquered and occupied southern Portuguese and Spanish territory since the 8th century. They'd been largely driven out during what is commonly and controversially referred to as the Reconquista, a series of crusade-like military campaigns that ended in 1492 with the fall of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. Many Moriscos converted to Christianity but kept their distinctive culture, including many Islamic practices. King Felipe II's assimilation policies in the late 1500s sparked various Morisco rebellions and hundreds of thousands remained. Now, Archbishop Juan de Ribera, Viceroy of Valencia, launched a smear and fear campaign. Moriscos plotted to take over the country, murder its people, and force everyone to become Muslims. Spain's first minister, the Duke of Lerma, and therefore King Felipe III, agreed. On April 9, 1609, on the same day Felipe signed the 12-year truce for the Netherlands, the king issued a decree for the expulsion of all Moriscos from Spain and the confiscation of everything they owned. Over the next few years, hundreds of thousands of able-bodied, hard-working Moriscos were shipped out to Tunis, Morocco, and tens of thousands fled into the rest of Europe. For instance, 25,000 Moorish families arrived at Bayonne in the south of France. King Henri IV of France consulted with the Viceroy of Canada to move them there. However, the Moriscos preferred to emigrate to Virginia. Spanish clergy and the population applauded the measure, and Lerma's popularity rose, for a while at least. However, the expulsion was ultimately a disaster. Cheap labor was gone, crops were no longer harvested, sugarcane and rice could no longer be cultivated, and homeowners could no longer collect rents because of the many abandoned homes. The expulsion led to another problem. Many Moriscos were highly skilled technological experts. They had built aqueducts, designed irrigation systems, were talented cloth manufacturers, knew all about trade, and made all kinds of technological advancements. All their knowledge and skills left Spain with them. When the Spanish government realized this blunder, they allowed 600 Morisco engineers and technicians to stay, but the damage was done. Meanwhile, the rebel Netherlands was dealing with a different religious meltdown. Once upon a time, in 1604, two theology professors at the University of Leiden, Jacobus Arminius and Franciscus Gomarus, had a difference of opinion on the Protestant religion. And by a difference of opinion, I mean a total war. This is super complex stuff that's been debated for centuries, but here is a simple version of the argument. Both Arminius and Gomarus agreed that God had decided before the creation of heaven and earth who would enter the kingdom of heaven, the chosen, and who would be rejected and go to hell, the lost. But they disagreed on whether God would reconsider his decision depending on a person's lifestyle and behavior on earth. Arminius said absolutely. Why else would anyone live responsibly? Gomarus said absolutely not. You could be the greatest sinner of all time. If you'd been chosen, you went to heaven. God's mercy would save you. This is predestination. They also disagreed on who was in charge of the church, its doctrine, and the appointments of clergy, ministers, and teachers. Arminius said the sovereign, aka the secular government, ruled the church, as was the custom in Europe at the time. But Gomarus said the Holy Spirit, as interpreted by the clergy during special assemblies and synods, ruled the church. The Protestant church broke into two camps, Arminians and Gomarians. Generally, local governments and magistrates preferred Arminius because he wanted them to have all the power, and most ordinary people favored Gomarus. Gomarus didn't think it was that big of a deal, at least nothing to break up a church over. However, when Gomarians refused to attend services led by reverends with Arminian leanings and started traveling long distances to hear the true word of God, this small deal threatened to escalate into a civil war, and resolving this issue wasn't gonna be easy. Back in the day, theology and politics were one, cujus regio eius religio, whose realm, his religion. It meant that a sovereign was in charge of the church, its doctrine and hiring practices. But in the Republic, things were complicated. After the states had declared themselves independent, the States General had become sovereign. Sort of, because each state was still its own sovereign. Sort of. And the Calvinist Church had developed during the early years of the war when there was no sovereign. They'd made their own doctrine and hired preachers and teachers themselves. According to Professor Arminius, the sovereign should take back control of the church. Professor Gomarus said no, the church was governed by the Holy Ghost now. Oldenbarnevelt backed Arminius. The sovereign was in charge of the church, and by sovereign he meant each state for themselves, not the States General. But the church dismissed this concept as too medieval and refused. Since the majority of the States General representatives were Gomarians, they demanded a national synod be held to determine the true faith. The magistrates of Leiden protested that the war had not been fought by a single church, but that all creeds had fought together against Spain. Religious coercion was hateful and would lead to slavery. But the Gomarians said that the Arminians were doing the coercing, forcing their doctrine down everyone's throats, and the very idea that every other religion should have a say in government was tantamount to treason. Well, Oldenbarnevelt agreed with that one. There should be only one religion calling the shots in the country. But which one? Or rather, which version of Protestantism? Oldenbarnevelt convened a national synod to stop the discussion. He wanted to revise the Netherlands Creed, the current church doctrine, and make the public church more theologically flexible. He also wanted to subject it to the state's governments. However, when Oldenbarnevelt discovered that the Orthodox Calvinists were only interested in confirming that the confession and the catechism were immutable, the Attorney General cancelled the synod. Every state should figure this out for themselves. Before the truce was concluded, Gibraltar battle hero, now VOC Admiral Pieter Willemszoon Verhoef, arrived in the East Indies with a 13-ship fleet and about 750 soldiers to once more try to seize Malacca. The fleet's under-merchant was Jan Pieterszoon Koen, and Jacques Spex was also on board, headed for Japan. Some viewers may remember these two men from my The Batavia series on this channel. Check it out. The helmsman of one of the ships was Piet Pieterszoon Hein. Verhoef split the fleet. He sent one section to Ternate and Tidor to cut off the Portuguese supply lines, while he sailed to the Banda Islands, carrying gifts and a letter from Count Maurits requesting permission to build a fortress. Verhoef started talks to get a monopoly on the spice trade, but the Bandanese preferred multinational trade. When the negotiations stalled, the village elders asked Verhoef to attend a meeting in a village in the woods, alone. Then the admiral and 2 company men were beheaded. In the end, some 46 crew members, soldiers, and several important VOC council members died. Koen managed to escape. There were rumors that the English were involved in this murder, but information about this was lost. In retaliation, the company men looted and destroyed several Bandanese villages and massacred the Kampung Lebetaka on Banda. FYI, Piet Hein was non-military and not involved in this. Peace was concluded in August 1609, and the VOC got the monopoly they wanted. In 1610, a trade deal was made with Japan. Piet Hein returned to the Netherlands as captain of the Hollandia in 1612, got married, quit the VOC, and bought his own vessel to trade in the Mediterranean. Again, remember him. Meanwhile, merchants in Holland and Zeeland were pretty steamed that Oldenbarnevelt had put the West India Company plans on hold. Amsterdam especially couldn't forgive him for sacrificing the super lucrative colonial trade for a truce. They'd already been forced to abandon the salt trade there. And now, the Republic could not establish colonies and trading posts in the Americas, while Spain, Portugal, England, and France gradually conquered the West. And with the truce, trade in the East began to suffer because Portugal got back in the game. Lisbon now competed with Amsterdam, since, as per the agreement, the VOC was no longer allowed to fight the Portuguese. In 1608, VOC stock had increased in value by over 200%, but it dropped to 135% during the truce. However, overall, the Republic didn't suffer too much. Trade in the Baltics with the Ottoman Empire and in other European waters flourished. Meanwhile, the southern Netherlands was also doing pretty well. The Spanish forces had been reduced and so had the taxes to pay for them. The cities recovered quickly, all the devastation in the countryside was restored, and agriculture is doing really well. Manufacturing got a boost and the linen trade recovered completely. Archduke Albrecht and Archduchess Isabel worked hard to become beloved by the population. They followed Professor Justus Lipsius' philosophy that to have political stability, the people needed to be doing well. The crown served as a father figure and was better than a bunch of squabbling burghers who were only after power, as was the case in the Republic. As a Spaniard sarcastically commented, Albrecht treated the Southerners more like children than subjects. The couple also pushed the Counter-Reformation hard and increased the church's influence through Jesuit-run Sunday schools, the arts and book printing, all to re-educate and desecularize the population. Still, the archdukes longed to unite all the states and eliminate the Calvinists. The loyal states were doing well, the Republican states were doing better, except perhaps in agriculture. It was peacetime in Europe, but there was trouble ahead. Johann Wilhelm, the Duke of Jülich-Kleve-Berg, had passed away in March 1609 without heirs. And his succession turned into a big ol' mess, with both Roman Catholics and Protestants wanting control of the most densely populated region of the Holy Roman Empire. The local succession laws were very tricky, and the Habsburg Empire was a political nightmare. It was super fragmented with 300 imperial states of all shapes and sizes, from the 7 Kurfürsts or prince-electors who elected the Holy Roman Emperor, to prince-bishoprics and imperial cities. There were basically 4 pretenders for the Jülich-Kleve-Berg succession through Johann Wilhelm's sisters. 2 had a half-decent chance, Kurfürst Johann Sigismund von Brandenburg and Duke Philipp Ludwig von Pfalz-Neuburg. Both were Lutheran and big financial supporters of the war in the Dutch Republic. However, Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II felt that since there were no direct male heirs, everything reverted to him until a proper successor was found. Not that he would look very hard to find one. With everything the emperor hadn't been doing for the Protestants, they no longer believed in Rudolf's neutrality and geared up for war. The Protestant rulers started improving fortifications and gathering supplies and troops. Things got extra spicy when Kurfürst Friedrich IV von Pfalz, Count Mauritz's brother-in-law, formed the Protestant Union. Maximilian I, the Duke of Bayern, responded by setting up the Roman Catholic League. Meanwhile, in Jülich-Kleve-Berg, Brandenburg and Neuburg followed the advice of Johann of Oldenbarneveld and other German princes. They made an arrangement, the Treaty of Dortmund. They agreed to rule the area together and to occupy the whole territory with their troops in defiance of the emperor. Neuburg was stationed in Jülich-Berg, while Brandenburg held Kleve and Mark. Then Archduke Leopold V, Bishop of Passau and member of the newly formed Roman Catholic League, convinced the emperor to annul the Dortmund Treaty and appoint him as the imperial commissioner. He hoped to be rewarded with the crown of Bohemia and perhaps become Rudolf's successor. The bishop entered Jülich disguised as a servant. That Roman Catholic governor welcomed him and his 5 men with open arms. Leopold then sent a friendly message to the rebel States General to back off. The emperor would decide who ruled the duchies. Oldenbarneveld was like, lift one finger against these guys and we'll mess you up. Those are big words coming from a small republic. Well, Oldenbarneveld hoped he'd get France to back him up. But would the Roman Catholic King of France side with the Protestants against the Roman Catholic Habsburg? Why, yes. Yes, he would. Why, though? The King of France's personal life was tough. He barely had any friends, and his wife, Maria de' Medici, and his mistresses hated him. They conspired with each other and his ministers to end his policies and his life. In early 1609, Henri planned a fancy costume ball at the Louvre. After a group of high-born ladies finished their dance rehearsal for the ball, they passed the king in the Great Gallery. Henri locked eyes with one of the dancers and felt himself pierced to the heart and was ready to faint away. The 55-year-old had fallen head over heels in love with the 15-year-old Charlotte Marguerite de Montmorency. The king persuaded her fiancé François de Bassompierre, Marquis d'Arouet, to end their engagement. He then paid his nephew Henri de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, 100,000 livres a year to marry her instead. Now he could see her whenever he wanted. And by see, I mean, well, you know. Henri thought his love was poetic, others thought it was pathetic, and the scandal was immense. Condé was not amused. Though he didn't care for Marguerite, he suddenly moved to the countryside with his wife to get away from creepy Uncle Henri. But the king went all Edward Cullen on the princess and entered sneaky stalker mode. One day, as Marguerite passed a royal hunting party, she discovered the king was hiding in the group dressed up as a lackey. And while visiting the castle of the governor of Amiens, Henri stood in the courtyard holding his left hand on his heart to show that it was wounded and blowing her kisses with the other. In the fall of 1609, the Prince of Condé grabbed his wife and fled to the Spanish Netherlands with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Spain granted Condé asylum and offered him all the help he needed. And now this fling became an international incident. The fugitives headed to the prince's sister, Eleonora de Bourbon-Condé, in Breda in the Republic. She and her husband, Prince Philips Willem of Orange, had been staying at Nassau Castle since the truce. Furious King Henri demanded that Oldenbarneveld detain Condé the moment he set foot in Breda. But Oldenbarneveld thought this whole thing was très awkward and told the States General to simply forbid the Condés from entering the Republic. Prince Philips Willem then invited the couple to stay with him and his wife at Nassau Palace in Brussels. King Henri swore he'd march on Brussels to take the couple back to France by force. But his counselors were like, dude, chill. They started negotiating for the prince's return with the archdukes, who now got entangled in the mess. The ultra-chaste Archduke Albrecht could barely look the princess in the eye, but later admitted she was indeed gorgeous, and Marquis Ambrogio Spinola Doria instantly fell in love with Marguerite. Spinola held massive banquets and festivals in her honor, the likes of which had not been seen in Brussels for years. He even had renowned artist Peter Paul Rubens come over from Antwerp to paint her portrait. The princess was unimpressed with Spinola's efforts to woo her, but Condé threatened to throw his wife out the window if she refused to caress the Marquis. Meanwhile, Spinola plotted with Philips Willem to get the couple to Spain. The valiant, creepy stalker dude King Henri vowed to intercept them if they fled by land, and asked the States to send out 2 warships to catch them if they attempted an escape by sea. But when the Prince of Condé visited Archduke Leopold in Jülich with Spinola, King Henri decreed the prince had committed high treason and that France was under threat. The French government agreed. Henri was now determined to humiliate the House of Austria, keep Spain from his borders, and protect the Republic, his only true ally. The king made a treaty with Brandenburg and Neuburg, the Evangelical Union. The emperor and the pope protested vehemently against Henri's interference in the succession matter, but they can suck it. He told the States General to send their forces to the frontier in Gelderland to show everyone they weren't kidding. And Count Maurits was like, woo! Gotta grease up my boots! Meanwhile, the situation in the Republic grew more restless. Gomarus fans started harassing Arminius and his supporters. They said the professor was a heretic and worse, a Jesuit. He should be silenced. Arminius turned to Oldenbarneveld for help. The professor was allowed to defend himself in a States of Holland meeting. He declared that he had peaceful intentions and respected the secular government to oversee that the public church taught the right things. This was music to the ears of the regents. However, Gomarus protested. Church business was not a state nor a municipal government business. Every church in every city had an opinion about this. For instance, in Alkmaar, reverends had to sign the proper confession, that is, the Calvinist one, or leave. This made the state government mad, and they intervened. Then the state senate objected and said that they were not governed by the state, and the church had every right to remove bad apples. But the state government said, "Nuh-uh," and the reverends returned. Count Maurits, although a religious man, wanted to remain neutral in the debate. He later said, "My lords, I'm a soldier, not a divine. These are matters of theology which I don't understand and about which I don't trouble myself." About the predestination discussion he said, "I know nothing of predestination, whether it is green or whether it is blue." But to resolve the issue and keep the peace, the stadtholder exercised his right to assemble a new city council using annual elections. He installed a predominantly Gomarian municipal council, who then fired the Bad Apple reverends, and it was done. This made Oldenbarneveld mad. Then the militia got involved. They occupied the city hall and demanded that the Gomarians be removed from government. Next thing you know, Oldenbarneveld undid Maurits's intervention. This was a flagrant violation of the stadtholder's rights and set a dangerous precedent. Apparently, an urban militia could now impose its political and theological will and remove a regent's administration. But Maurits let Oldenbarneveld have this win. He just wanted there to be peace. But things got extra confusing when Professor Arminius died in 1609 and Leiden University needed a new professor. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing in Utrecht. For years there had been tensions between the Calvinist guilds and the wealthy patricians in the city of Utrecht. A large section of Utrecht had remained Roman Catholic and wanted to exercise their religion publicly, while others complained about lost privileges, the new beer brewing policies, and, like everyone in history ever, the taxes. Dirk Kanter, former mayor of Utrecht, clever politician and acquaintance of stadtholder Maurits, took advantage of the situation. He promised the Roman Catholics church buildings and told others he'd restore lost privileges, fix the beer brewery rights, and reduce taxes. Kanter and armed dissidents took City Hall in an organized assault, overpowered the magistracy, and appointed a new city council. Kanter and his buddy Hendrik van Helsdingen were elected mayors. Many regents and nobles fled the city, leaving the rebels in charge. The Secretary of State of Utrecht, Gilles van Ledenberg, asked Oldenbarneveld for help. The States General should use force to save the city from a reckless and revolutionary government. None of the other states cared about it, and both the Council of State and Count Maurits advised against taking action. After all, as Oldenbarneveld kept saying, only the sovereign state of Utrecht could take care of its internal affairs. Plus, Kanter had hinted he'd give Maurits more power. But after the talks to reconcile the parties failed, Oldenbarneveld and the States of Holland persuaded the States General to send in troops to get the guilds back in line. Count Maurits, as the stadtholder of Utrecht and captain general of its army, was summoned to go and take care of it. Maurits was like, "I think I just came down with something, I can't go." The States then told Maurits's half-brother Count Frederik Hendrik of Nassau to go instead. The stadtholder insisted his brother was too young, he couldn't handle the responsibility. The man was 26. The States ignored Maurits's protests. On April 5, 1610, Frederik Hendrik headed out with members of the Council of State and the States of Utrecht. He had to take the town by any means necessary, disarm every citizen, and install a garrison of 2,000 foot and 300 horse. Kanter and his friends were like, "Bring it on!" And the Catholic priests showed up with shovels in hand, ready to dig trenches. But the army coming their way was massive. The rebels opened the city gates the next day and surrendered with easy terms. The new magistracy was disbanded, the old one reinstated, a garrison installed, and the regents and nobles returned. Not a drop of blood had been spilled. The kings of France and England were concerned with the situation, but the archdukes and the Spaniards popped the champagne and cheered that this would be the first revolt of many. Kanter and Helsdingen did attempt another coup in December, but the duo was caught and banished. Kanter died in North Holland a little later. Maurits let Oldenbarneveld claim another win. The stadtholder may have been just a soldier, but he was also a keen politician and smart. Maurits didn't care for Oldenbarneveld and his gang, but a standoff would only paralyze the Republic and unleash a civil war. He was just gonna do his job and keep the peace. The proverbial holy doo-doo hit the fan when Oldenbarneveld chose Professor Arminius' replacement, Conrad Fortius, a professor and minister of theology. He was considered Arminius squared and worse. The local Calvinist crowd went wild. And so did King James I of England. He was convinced Vortius was the devil incarnate, or as he put it, an arch-heretic, a plague, a sorcerer, and an atheist. He demanded the states ban him from the country. If they didn't, he would consider all of Holland an enemy of the crown. He even ordered a book burning of the professor's works at St. Paul's churchyard and both universities. James and the English bishops were appalled by the lawless religious situation in the United States. Count Maurits hadn't cared much either way about Vortius's appointment, but sided with King James. Oldenbarneveld was confused. The King of England had no right to interfere in the Republic's internal affairs. But to calm everyone down, he quickly had Vortius testify under oath before the States of Holland to address King James's accusations. If the professor was found guilty, he would be disbarred. Vortius gave all the correct answers, but he was told to put it in writing, and was given a year and a half to do it. In the meantime, he wasn't allowed to teach or live in Leiden or The Hague, and a few inoffensive professors were hired instead. Everything was smoothed over, except that King James was now in the Gomarian, aka the Dutch Puritans' corner. This was interesting, because he absolutely despised the Puritans in his own country. Recently, using the Seditious Sectaries Act of 1593, he outlawed a group calling themselves the Pilgrims who had left the Church of England. The Pilgrims had moved to Holland in 1607 and eventually settled in Leiden. On February 13, 1610, King Henri's carefully planned attempt to kidnap Charlotte Marguerite, the Princess of Condé, from Nassau Palace in Brussels to return her to France failed because Henri had blabbed about the plan to his wife. Maria, fed up with her husband's shenanigans, sent someone to warn the Prince of Condé. Archduke Albrecht moved the princess to his place to live under the protection of the Archduchess Isabella, but the place was like a convent, and Marguerite was soon miserable and bored. She started writing letters to her chevalier, her heart, her all the world, King Henri, begging him to rescue her from her dungeon. The more frustrated King Henri became with the Prince of Condé withholding his beloved Marguerite from him, the more he was prepared to go to war and destroy the House of Austria. However, the king told the papal nuncius that the moment Archduke Albrecht returned Princess Marguerite to him, he would drop everything and embrace Spain. So, the Princess of Condé was the main reason for the attack, and he meant to have her back? Henri fumed with rage. I do mean to have her back, and I shall have her back. No one shall prevent it, not even the Lieutenant of God on earth. But the nuncius knew the Archduke would never do something as dishonorable as separating wife and husband. War was inevitable. King Henri planned a three-pronged attack on the House of Austria. The first attack consisted of three forces. Henri would lead 26,000 foot, including 6,000 Swiss and 6,000 horse waiting at Mézières, into the German duchies. Count Maurits would lead 12,000 foot and 2,000 horse gathered at the Schenkenschans to Düsseldorf, where Prince Christian von Anhalt and a German Protestant army of 10,000 men would team up with them both. Maréchal de la Force assembled a second French army of 12,000 foot and 2,000 horse in the Pyrenees. He would work with the displaced Moriscos and invade Spain. While Charles-Emmanuel, the Duke of Savoy, was ready to invade the Duchy of Milan with some 10,000 foot and 1,200 horse, supported by a third French army of 15,000 men led by Maréchal de Lesdiguières. Henri was convinced that when the King of Spain realized he was under attack from three different armies, he would make wee-wee in his big boy pants and surrender. For a while though, no one, not even his allies, knew what Henri was up to. Everyone worried that the Princess of Condé would be returned and it would all be over. The king then confirmed his plans. Next Tuesday, I shall cause the queen to be crowned at Saint-Denis. The following Thursday, she will make her entry into Paris. The next day, I shall take my departure. At the end of this month, I shall cross the Meuse at Mézières or in that neighborhood. He told Count Maurits, Count Willem Lodewijk, Oldenbarneveld, and several deputies of the States General to meet him in Jülich to coordinate the attack. Maurits was beyond thrilled that he would finally meet King Henri the Great in person for the first time. Everything was ready to unleash the dogs of war. So, what preparations had Spain, the Pope, the Habsburg Empire, and the Habsburg Roman Catholic League made to face this overwhelming force? Zip, nada, zilch. No one could afford troops. Well, the House of Austria was about to be ruined. But first, it was time for a coronation. For years, the Spanish had been telling everyone that King Henri's divorce from Marguerite de Valois was invalid, and that, therefore, his marriage to Maria de' Medici was null and void. It would mean that, despite having had 6 children with Maria, including 2 surviving boys, Henri had no heirs. But a coronation with a proper sacrament should stop the Spanish efforts to delegitimize the king and queen's children. Henri was in no mood for any of it, but gave in to Maria's incessant demands. 2 days later than planned, on Thursday, May 13, 1610, Maria de' Medici was officially crowned Queen of France and Regent of the Kingdom at Saint-Denis in a ceremony with all the bells and whistles. The day after the coronation, on Friday, May 14th, the French king was headed to the arsenal to finalize preparations for the German campaign with Maximilien de Bethune, the Duke of Sully. At 4 p.m., the king's carriage, with 7 people in it, got stuck in a traffic jam on the Rue de la Ferronnerie. He was locked in by a cart filled with wine on one side and a cart filled with hay on the other. As several men got out of the carriage to make way for the king, François Ravaillac climbed up on the carriage's wheel and stabbed Henri between the 2nd and 3rd ribs. Henri cried out, "I'm hurt!" Ravaillac stabbed again, this time through the heart. His 3rd stab, for good measure, went into someone else's arm, reaching out to shield the king. Jean-Louis de Nogaret de la Valette, Duc d'Epernon, who sat next to the king, threw his cloak over the body and ordered the carriage back to the Louvre. But underway, King Henri IV succumbed to his injuries. He died, aged 56. Ravaillac didn't run. He was seized and imprisoned at the Conciergerie, where he was tortured into giving up his accomplices. He insisted he had acted alone. Ravaillac believed Henri planned to start a war with the Pope and felt called to stop him. His confession was written down in illegible handwriting, but supposedly contained the names of the Duke of Epernon and Maria de' Medici. However, Epernon imprisoned or killed off anyone who dared to testify against him or Maria, and the investigation concluded that this had been an isolated action of a madman. On May 27th, Ravaillac received the standard punishment for regicide. He was tortured, then drawn and quartered. Count Maurits wept bitter tears after hearing of King Henri's death, and Count Frederick Hendrik, who up to this point was really called Hendrik Frederik, switched his names around after his godfather's death, and he signed all his letters F. Henri. There were now open bets on the exchange in Antwerp that Count Maurits would be assassinated next, with the odds of it happening within the month being considered very high. Count Willem Lodewijk asked Oldenbarneveld to do something because he didn't think Maurits cared. Maurits didn't. The states formally begged the stadtholder to take special measures to protect himself. Maurits didn't. With King Henri's death, Maria de' Medici was now regent of the king's eldest son, the 9-year-old King Louis XIII. No, not the cognac. Well, yes, but no. However, for years Maria had been entirely in the thrall of Concino Concini, an Italian adventurer and opportunist, and his wife, Leonora Dori Galagai. Concini was very pro-Spain, and there were even persistent rumors that he was King Louis's father. The man in charge of government was the 66-year-old Nicolas de Neufville, Seigneur de Villeroy, who had been Secretary of State for 42 years under 3 kings. He was an old leaguer who loved power, the Pope, and the House of Austria. The secretary quickly concluded some marriage deals with Spain. King Louis would marry the Spanish princess Ana Maria Mauricia de Austria once they were both 14. And Louis's sister, Elizabeth, was betrothed to the Spanish crown prince Felipe. Villeroy also cancelled any funny foreign business and said any arrangements and treaties made for foreign wars had died with King Henri. All the millions set aside for the war were soon squandered among the insatiable courtiers, lovers, and partisans. However, the states quickly concluded a new treaty in which France promised to support Brandenburg and Neuburg. And Villeroy sent Maréchal de la Châtre with 8,000 foot and 1,200 horse to Germany to assist the Republic in the Grab the Duchies for the Protestants campaign, because that was still on. On July 13, 1610, Count Maurits crossed the border with 13,000 foot, 3,000 horse and 30 cannons and reached Jülich unopposed. He besieged the citadel with his usual precision and flawless calculations. He was in a hurry because he feared once de La Châtre arrived, he'd seize the place for France. By the time the French troops arrived, it was nearly done. The place surrendered 2 weeks later and was given reasonable terms. The Roman Catholics were allowed to worship, the city magistrates remained, and the citadel was handed over to Brandenburg and Neuburg. At the end of September, the state's troops returned home without a single casualty of war. The ousted Archduke Leopold and his 9,000 foot and 3,000 horse now headed for Prague to get him that crown of Bohemia. They pillaged, harassed, and blackmailed the countryside as they went. Those in Prague asked the emperor's younger brother Matthias of Austria to help them. After he showed up with 7,000 men, Leopold and his troops disappeared, and Bohemia crowned Matthias their king. Meanwhile, Count Maurits believed that France, now in Spain's pocket, was done for and looked for alliances with other Protestant states, England perhaps, but Oldenbarnevelt kept his focus on France. This raised a few eyebrows. Why would the Attorney General want to work with the Spanish-backed government? It must be treason. Meanwhile, in Aachen, Germany, Protestants kicked the Roman Catholics out of the city council, and when fights broke out in Düren, folks braced for a full-blown war. Then, on January 20th, 1612, Emperor Rudolf died, aged 59. His younger brother, 54-year-old Matthias, succeeded him as the Holy Roman Emperor of the Habsburg Empire. Matthias had been the governor-general for the rebels back in 1577, but only time would tell if the new Roman Catholic emperor would fight for the Protestants or not. I mean, the scribe of Willem could still be holding a grudge after the rebels had so unceremoniously ditched him to make way for François, the Duke of Anjou, back in 1581. Meanwhile, the High Council of The Hague declared the difference of opinion between Arminians and Gomarians to be too insignificant and told everyone to just get along already. But the Gomarians started inciting the public against their enemy, the Arminians, both in the church and the government. The pamphlet war started right back up again. Reverend Johannes Uyttenboogaert and the Arminians had drawn up a remonstrance of the Arminians for the states of Holland, apparently at the instigation of Oldenbarnevelt. In the document, they denied the claims that they wanted to change the divine service and were out to create chaos and division within the church. They also outlined their doctrine in 5 points. Among other things, they said that the state had authority over the church and should appoint pastors, establish doctrine, and convene synods to revise the Netherlands Creed. The states also had the right to influence these synods. The church had no sovereignty. It was allowed to persuade, but not to force, to encourage, but not to command. The now famous Remonstrance was signed by 44 ministers and submitted to the States of Holland by Oldenbarnevelt. Uyttenboogaert and Oldenbarnevelt agreed that the Gomarians had to be rooted out of the public church and to end the theological disputes to minimize their impact on public life. The States of Holland decreed that until further notice, no man should be required to believe more than had been laid down in the 5 points. However, the Gomarian preachers drew up an equally famous contra-remonstrance of 7 points, opposing the remonstrance's 5 points. They explained their anti-Arminian position and rejected any amendments to the Netherlands Creed. Furthermore, the Gomarians argued that the church could not be forced by the secular authority to employ pastors who rejected its own teachings. They demanded a national synod be held to determine the true doctrine, the 5 or the 7 points. There could only be one, not both. The Arminians and Gomarians became known under many names: Remonstrance and Contra-Remonstrance, the flexible and the precise, the relaxed and the strict, or as we call them today, the Methodists and Calvinists. Oldenbarnevelt dismissed the Contra-Remonstrance as a fringe phenomenon, a collection of Puritans, largely Frisian or Flemish. Gomarus was a Fleming and Arminius a Hollander, but that was a big mistake. Huge. 30-year-old Hugo de Groot, pensionary of Rotterdam, was sent to England by the VOC to negotiate some of the Anglo-Dutch differences of opinion about the East Indies. While he was out there, Oldenbarnevelt asked de Groot to persuade those around James to get the king to withdraw his support for the Contra-Remonstrance. Hugo de Groot thought he had convinced King James to stop backing the Dutch Puritans, but James hadn't been won over at all. I mean, not even a little bit. The King of England and his ambassador in the Republic, Sir Ralph Winwood, were angry about how the Remonstrant heretics treated the righteous Contra-Remonstrants. They decided it was time for the commoner Oldenbarnevelt, who was clearly pushing the heretic agenda, to go. But they needed allies. "Hello, Count Maurits." Winwood asked the stadtholder whether he believed the League was plotting to undermine the religion on which the wealth of England and the Republic was built. The Count said yes. What was his evidence? The marriages of the French and Spanish houses, of course. Maurits had taken the bait. What was his solution? Maurits figured that if King James headed up a counter-league with England, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, the Protestants in Germany, maybe the French Huguenots, and teamed up with the Republic, they could protect themselves against this French-Spanish alliance. The stadtholder was on the hook. But how would that work? The man in charge of the Republic behaved like a servant of the French monarchy and, by extension, Spain. Shouldn't he, go? Maurits agreed that Oldenbarnevelt was entirely too wrapped up in France and, by extension, Spain. He was a dangerous man with far too much power and had to be stopped. It was the first time the Count openly spoke of Oldenbarnevelt's possible high treason, though he didn't have a shred of evidence. Time to reel Maurits in. Winwood delivered King James's letter offering Count Maurits to become a member of the Most Noble Order of the Garter. This was the most senior order of knighthood in England, whose members were and are handpicked by the sovereign. To be accepted in the order was a huge honor for Maurits and elevated the prestige of the House of Nassau a ton. The stadtholder was very honored, but said that the States General had to agree to this appointment. They did. On February 4th, 1613, Count Maurits was installed in Flushing. Some 400 years later, in 2019, Dutch King Willem-Alexander of Orange-Nassau, like his ancestors, also received the Garter from the late Queen Elizabeth II, right beside Felipe VI, the King of Spain, which I find hilarious for some reason. But if the English thought heaping the Count with all the honors made him ready to pounce on Oldenbarnevelt, they were wrong. Maurits didn't act on his suspicions at all, and he wasn't on anyone's hook. Case in point, Count Maurits's brothers-in-law, the Prince of Condé, and Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, the Duke of Bouillon, were causing trouble in France. They were Huguenots who vehemently protested the Spanish influence at the French court and demanded that the Spanish marriages be cancelled. Maurits said he supported them, but when Condé, Bouillon, and other malcontent princes started an uprising in France in 1614, the stadtholder forbade the French soldiers in his service from joining the rebellion of his relatives. Instead, Maurits put the French regiments at the disposal of Maria de' Medici. He also offered more of his own troops should she need them. The French rebellion ended on May 15, 1614 with the Peace of Saint-Amand, but the troubles were far from over. The Republic's ambassador for France, François van Aarsens, had become quite passive-aggressive at the French court. He wrote frank and brutal dispatches about the Queen Regent's court to Oldenbarnevelt, but he was shocked to discover that these reports had been sent back to the French court, who were now very upset with him. Van Aarsens became convinced that Oldenbarnevelt had done it. The Attorney General swore he'd been ill, as he often was these days, and believed that someone else sent those reports without his knowledge to create problems. Van Aarsens didn't believe him, and was furious at this betrayal. How was he supposed to do his job with backstabbers like Oldenbarnevelt undermining his delicate work? The Queen Regent and Concini, and, well, the entire French government, had wanted Van Aarsens gone for a while now. When Van Aarsens was in The Hague for a visit, they sent a new ambassador to the Netherlands, Aubry de Mourier, who threatened that, if in spite of us you throw him at our feet, we shall fling him back at your head. Both Count Maurits and Oldenbarnevelt supported the ambassador, but for the sake of maintaining peaceful relations with France, the man had to go. Van Aarsens was sure that the Spanish had bribed Oldenbarnevelt to get rid of him, but he resigned. Van Aarsens swore vengeance on Oldenbarnevelt, and he knew just who to use to get it. Hello, Count Maurits! So, Oldenbarnevelt's newly minted arch-enemy got a job as the Count's personal advisor on all things French. And he told the stadtholder all the dirty little secrets his old boss had kept from Maurits over the years. Still, the Count left the Attorney General alone. 2 years had passed since Matthias became the Holy Roman Emperor. As king, he had been forced to grant religious concessions to Protestants in Austria, Moravia, and Hungary when he had allied with them against Rudolf, but as emperor, he went full-on counter-reformation on everyone. In other words, he chose to re-establish a rejuvenated Roman Catholicism and challenge Protestantism. Matthias put Prince-Elector Johann Georg I von Sachsen in charge of Jülich, dismissing Brandenburg and Neuburg. Sachsen was Lutheran, but he didn't care for either of the men, and aligned himself with the emperor and the Roman Catholics. To make things extra complicated, Brandenburg had become Calvinist. Plus, Wolfgang Wilhelm, the Duke of Neuburg's son, wanted some skin in the succession game. He married Magdalena of Bayern, the sister of Maximilian of Bayern of the Roman Catholic League, converted to the Roman Catholic faith, and asked for support from the archdukes in Brussels and the King of Spain. Brandenburg supporters tried to drive the Neuburg gang out of Düsseldorf, but were pushed out instead. The fight for the strategic area close to the Republic's border was back on. But Oldenbarneveld was dangerously late to intervene in an area so vital to the Republic's protection. This raised a few eyebrows. It must be treason. Eventually, Republican troops kicked out Neuburg's garrison from Jülich, handed the place to Brandenburg, but left a garrison of 1,400 foot and 200 horse in its citadel, just to be safe. The door to the Spanish Netherlands was firmly in rebel hands. This made Spain very mad. King Philippe and Archduke Albrecht felt the rebels' move had violated the 12 years truce, but with only 8,000 foot and a handful of horse in the Spanish Netherlands, they couldn't do a thing. By comparison, the Republic had 20,000 foot and 3,000 horse, not counting the French and English regiments. The Spanish government immediately sent 400,000 crowns to Brussels. Ambrogio Spinola had just gotten his much-coveted Spanish grandee title and became Marqués de los Balbasis. Don Ambrogio quickly gathered an army of 18,000 foot and 3,000 horse. On August 22, 1614, he made camp midway between Maastricht and Aachen. That same day, Philipp Ludwig von Neuburg died a few days before he had had a chance to disinherit his eldest son and heir, Wolfgang Wilhelm. The state saw where this was going and immediately strengthened the Jülich garrison with 3,000 infantry and a regiment of horse. England had sort of sided with the Protestants in the succession crisis. King James had married off his daughter, Elizabeth Stuart, to the Prince-Elector of Pfalz, Friedrich V, Count Maurits's nephew, on February 14, 1613, and the couple had welcomed their first child, Heinrich Friedrich, on January 1, 1614. However, England remained largely on the sidelines because King James was still trying to marry off his son and heir Charles to a Spanish infanta. Count Maurits took 14,000 foot and 3,000 horse into Germany, but there was no declaration of war, and he and Spinola were under strict orders not to make a move against each other. It became a weird phantom campaign. On August 24th, Spinola besieged and recaptured Aachen without much effort on Emperor Matthias's behalf. He replaced the Protestant government with a Roman Catholic one and left 1,400 Germans behind. He then seized several towns like Orsau, Düren and Neuss. After destroying Mülheim's fortifications, Spinola crossed the Rhine at Rheinberg and swooped down on Wesel. Losing the Protestant stronghold Wesel would be a disaster for the Republic, but the town refused to let a state's garrison in. They were imperial citizens, they'd be all right. Well, they weren't. They would have been fine if they had accepted a garrison because neither party wanted to restart the war. Spinola arrived and started setting up the cannons, and Wesel surrendered 3 days later. They braced themselves for the customary plunder, murder, and outrage, but the Marquis strictly forbade it. In the terms of surrender, Spinola said he'd restore Wesel to the Protestants once the states gave up Jülich. The people in the Republic were furious that Oldenbarneveld hadn't done more to stop Spinola. It must be treason. Meanwhile, Count Maurits and his men also occupied several towns like Hochham, Liebstadt and the county of Mark. But the states and Spanish armies politely kept moving out of each other's way as they seized their respective towns. And when they accidentally ran into each other, not a shot was fired. The men of both commanders were clearly highly disciplined. Spinola captured and garrisoned Xanten, but he'd been leaving so many troops behind in towns that he hardly had an army left, and he couldn't move on Emmerich and Reis. Count Maurits grabbed those towns instead. But this was clearly a futile exercise. In October 1614, Spinola and Maurits and a host of ambassadors started peace negotiations at Xanten. They divided up the territories by drawing lots. Neuburg chose Jülich and Berg. Brandenburg picked Kleve and Mark. Emperor Matthias tried to stop the signing of the treaty to keep the duchies for himself until the succession was sorted out. But the Treaty of Xanten was signed on November 12, 1614. However, Spain refused to ratify it. As a result, neither army withdrew, and Maurits and Spinola distributed their troops in their respective territories. As careful as the Republic and Spain were about maintaining the peace in Europe, as careless were they in the East Indies. The VOC accused the Spanish of starting fights on the Moluccas, and the States General declared the ceasefire in the East null and void. The VOC could once more kick butt. When Hugo de Groot returned from his talks in England and thought he had won King James over to the Arminian side, he openly chose the Remonstrant side and turned Rotterdam into an Arminian stronghold. He unleashed on the Gomarians, and the thing devolved into full-on cancel culture. Any Gomarian church services in Rotterdam were forbidden, and anyone caught had to pay hefty fines, and anyone who spoke out about it was punished. When a Contra-Remonstrant broker said he'd rather be married by a pig than a Rotterdam parson, the Rotterdam government revoked his citizenship for a year and took away his brokering rights for life. A Schiedam book printer was disgusted and entered a lottery with the lines, "In the name of the Prince of Orange, I ask once and again, what is the difference between Rotterdam, Inquisition, and Spain?" The man was imprisoned for 14 days. Granted, no one was being burned at the stake, but still. Hugo wasn't interested in total tolerance. He wrote in the Resolutie tot den Vrede der Kerken, Resolution for the Peace of the Churches, that for a government to maintain stability and order, it should regulate and even restrict freedom of conscience and expression. In a state-controlled church, the government should force the people to obey all spiritual, political, and social matters. Oldenbarnevelt was like, "That's my boy." In January 1614, Oldenbarnevelt and de Groot teamed up to pass a resolution in the States of Holland to enforce this limited tolerance. Several cities objected, but the duo pushed the resolution through with the thinnest of margins. From now on, a city's government would decide which topics could be debated and which could not. The cities of Holland could outlaw any form of opposition to what they considered publicly acceptable views from the pulpits, in pamphlets, and in any other public forum. People could think and believe what they wanted in private, but everyone had to toe the government's line in public. Any reverend, Gomarian, or Arminian who violated this guideline could be fired. The ruling was supposed to be impartial, but it was only used in Remonstrant towns and against Contra-Remonstrant ministers. Only occasionally did Oldenbarnevelt intervene with overzealous Remonstrant city councils. Oldenbarnevelt believed the resolution would restore unity in Holland. But boy, was he wrong. By 1615, 3 assassination plots on Count Maurits were uncovered. The government demanded he do something about it, but Maurits didn't care. The Count continued to ride to his stables in Rijswijk at 3 in the afternoon like clockwork, without his bodyguards, despite the states begging him to bring them along. Then the states decided that the stadholder's carriage should always be accompanied by 3 armed squires on horseback, and told Maurits' steward to make it so. When the Count wasn't working, he studied, invented stuff, played tennis, and tried to improve his chess game. Maurits' relationship with Margarethe van Mechelen appeared to have ended around 1609, although some historians believe it continued. Either way, after the truce was concluded, Count Maurits started throwing massive, super extravagant parties. Things got pretty wild at the stadholder's court in The Hague, with various people expressing shock and disgust at what they saw going on there. Maurits fed his immense sexual appetite with women that he paid for sex. His camerlengo, Jean de Paris, doubled as his pimp who would find him his nightingales, as they were called. It was whispered that the 48-year-old Count liked his girls young, really young. Well, the man needed to get him some virgins, not catch the syphilis and all. Maurits gave de Paris the key to the stadholder's quarters and dismissed the gatekeepers, so his pimp could smuggle the ladies into the Nightingale room. The room is still called that today, by the way. Eventually, de Paris could dismiss the guards himself. An eyewitness described it rather poetically. There had been no virgin beauty in sight of which he did not undertake the hunt. However, the offense was cloaked in secrecy. Jupiter disguised himself most often in a shower of gold to see his mistresses, and this great Mars only walked in the shadows of the night, always in the shade of the sun. Maurits ended up with at least 5 additional children with these ladies, besides the 3 sons he already had with Margarethe. We know of the 5 because we have the receipts, literal receipts. He paid alimony for their upbringing and the boys' military education. The mothers of his children were often married off to men from his court, while the Count moved on to the next Nightingale. So, the Captain General engaged in behavior that, according to the rules he had made, got his men in his army executed. Everyone in town knew of the stadtholder's shameless behavior. It was an open secret, but no one dared say anything about it. Besides, there was no proof. Well, that was about to change. Count Maurits always dressed in a plain French style unless there was an official event. A brown woolen doublet and hose, a silk undervest, a short cloak lined with velvet, a plaited ruff on his neck and very loose boots. He ridiculed the French officers who wore super tight boots to show their fine legs, but had to break a sweat to put them on. He felt a man ought to be ready to jump into his boots and mountain ride in a heartbeat. The Count's half-brother Frederik Hendrik dressed quite the opposite. He wore flamboyant, bright colors and kept up with the latest fashion. Maurits only had 2 indulgences, the golden hilt of his sword and a rope of diamonds tied around his felt hat. One day, in March 1616, jeweler Jan van Wely came to Count Maurits's home to sell him a new diamond-encrusted hatband. He carried rare rubies and diamonds worth over 100,000 florins in his caskets. That's 1.5 million in today's dollars. Camerlengo de Paris salivated at the prospect of getting his hands on all that money and plotted with one of Maurits's bodyguards, Jean de la Vigne, to rob the man. De Paris invited Van Wely to watch one of Count Maurits's banquets. Dinners of high-ranking noblemen often had audiences. Once the man arrived, the duo would lure him away to another room, steal his stuff and kill him. But the jeweler didn't show up for the banquet, and de Paris asked him to come on another day around the lunch hour. The coast would be clear then, because Count Maurits always left for the Rijswijk stables at 3 p.m. sharp. On March 14, 1616, de Paris took Van Wely to Maurits's private study. The bodyguard had taken a gun from the Count's room and shot the jeweler in the head from behind. But Van Wely wasn't dead yet. He even got up from his chair after a while. De la Vigne then stabbed him repeatedly with a dagger he had taken from the Count's room, but the jeweler still breathed. They then strangled him with the blue ribbon of Maurits's Order of the Garter, which happened to be lying around the room. The duo quickly grabbed the loot, but by then Count Maurits had returned, and they quickly had to hide the body. They stuffed him behind the tapestry behind a couch. The Count then had dinner in that very room. At night, the Camerlengo and the soldier carried the body out of the room, down the stairs, through the great courtyard, and threw it into an ash pit. Van Wely's coat was found right away, but the jeweler had disappeared. His body was eventually found by a trash collector. The murderers remained unknown until de Paris started taking money out of Maurits's coffers. He got caught, and after a search of his home, they found Van Wely's jewels and money. De Paris was tortured, and after implicating de la Vigne, both were tried and sentenced to death by the cruelest method, breaking on the wheel. Right before de Paris' execution, Count Maurits sent his Reverend Johannes Uyttenbogaert to comfort the Camerlengo in his final hours. De Paris started talking about what had happened. When Uyttenbogaert wondered why they hadn't been seen by the guards in the courtyard, de Paris revealed his master's secret. He had sent them away, as he always did when Maurits had his nightingales over. Reverend Uyttenbogaert showed up at the stadtholder's apartment to have a little chat with the Count about his sinful behavior. We don't know what he said, but the moment the Reverend left the room, Maurits flew into a violent rage. He threw his hat on the floor and stamped on it, tore his clothes, broke his spurs, and snapped his sword. He refused to eat supper, and no one was allowed to speak to him. He was mad. But it appeared he stopped sleeping around, for a few years at least. Meanwhile, King Louis of France and the Infanta Anna had both turned 14, and the second cousins got married in November 1615. They were put under a lot of pressure to consummate their marriage so it couldn't be annulled in the future. However, unlike Maurits, Louis had little interest in doing the deed and ignored his bride. The Republic owed the English crown 8 million florins, about 750,000 pounds. 3 important seaports, Flushing, Fort Rammekens and Den Briel, were mortgaged against it. The states were unhappy with the situation. Article 5 of the peace treaty that the English had signed with the Spanish in 1604 stated that unless the Republic concluded a peace with the Archdukes quickly, King James could hand the cautionary towns over to the Spanish whenever he felt like it. But the states hadn't made peace, only a truce. It was now 1616, and the rebels fully expected to wake up any day now and see Spanish flags flying over those places. Furthermore, suppose James and Felipe concluded a marriage deal between Prince Charles and the Infanta Maria. In that case, Spain could demand those towns and order that the states retreat from Germany. And when King James started threatening that if the states defaulted on their loan, he would divvy up the territory between himself and the King of France, the states wanted Flushing, Fort Rammekens and Den Briel back sooner rather than later. The Republic's yearly earnings exceeded those of England and the Habsburg Empire. However, because of the situation in Germany, they couldn't afford to pay off the debt faster. King James, meanwhile, desperately needed money. His minions were just as greedy as their French counterparts, and James refused to grovel before Parliament and asked them for much-needed cash. Oldenbarnevelt saw an opportunity. He shrewdly schemed and plotted and convinced the English government to accept a new arrangement. He offered one lump sum of £250,000 to pay off all debt and get the cautionary towns back. All the minions at James's court were salivating at the prospect of so much cash and convinced the king to accept the deal. On June 11, 1616, the cautionary towns were officially returned to states' hands. According to the terms, the English garrisons were converted into 2 regiments led by Robert Sidney, the nephew of the late Sir Philip Sidney, and Horace Vere. James hadn't realized Oldenbarnevelt had tricked him into making a terrible deal, but when he figured it out, oh boy, a man had to go! In The Hague, Contra-Remonstrant Reverend Hendrikus Roseus, disgusted with his Arminian colleague Johannes Uitenboogaard, refused all communion with him. He was suspended and was no longer allowed to preach in the great church. So, every Sunday, Roseus held services 3 miles away in the Gomarian Rijswijk. 700 Gomarians followed him, trudging along the muddy roads even in the winter. Traveling contra-remonstrants had already earned the nickname Slijkgeuzen, mud beggars. Remonstrants were initially called mouth beggars, referring to their blasphemy, but eventually got the name Bavianen, baboons. Mainly because Arminius' followers in Dutch were called Arminianen. Arminianen, Bavianen, it rhymes. Since the group included city councillors and Court of Holland members, a rift was imminent. On February 23, 1616, Oldenbarnevelt told Count Maurits to go to Rijswijk with an army and use force to return the people to the regular church. The Attorney General figured he could simply tell the stadtholder to jump and he would jump, as he always had. But the stadtholder said no. Maurits wasn't gonna force people into a church they didn't want to be in at gunpoint. That would be replacing stake burning with a firing squad. There would be no new inquisition of any kind, not now, not ever. Besides, the soldiers had to be on standby to fight the Spanish. After this conversation with Oldenbarnevelt, Count Maurits was visibly upset. He hadn't wanted to get involved in this mess. Maurits had remained neutral since Alkmaar and Utrecht. Although Maurits was pro-contra-remonstrant, he was not anti-remonstrant. Besides, he hadn't spoken to Roseus in a long time, and though he disagreed with Reverend Uitenboogaard, he praised the man's eloquence and continued attending his services. But to him it seemed that Oldenbarnevelt was determined to push the Republic into a civil war. What a commoner thing to do! Despite Oldenbarnevelt's best efforts, Holland was anything but unified. Apart from a belt of remonstrant villages from South Holland via Utrecht and Nijmegen and Overijssel, most southern Holland towns and nearly all northern Holland villages were contra-remonstrant. And of the 15 church districts in Holland, 5 were absolutely Gomarian: Amsterdam, Dordrecht, Enkhuizen, Edam and Gorinchem. But there were no absolutely Arminian places, and fights between the opposing groups broke out constantly in those towns. As more and more Gomarian reverends were expelled from towns all over Holland, resistance to Oldenbarnevelt's resolution grew. Amsterdam and Dordrecht constantly expressed concern about the growing division among the states or cities of Holland and the States General. They told Oldenbarnevelt to back down and insisted on a national synod to resolve the dispute between the Remonstrants and the Contra-Remonstrants. A delegation was sent to Amsterdam to get them to toe the state's line. The delegation's leader, Hugo de Groot, unleashed a thunderous speech in the Amsterdam City Council. After listening for a while, Count Maurits shushed him, put his hand on his sword and said, "No need here of flowery orations and learned arguments. With this good sword I will defend the religion which my father planted in these states, and I should like to see the man who is going to prevent me." Okay. The balding stadtholder had a profound reverence for the memory of his father, who had always said he was Calvo y Calvinista, bald and Calvinist. When Oldenbarnevelt refused to listen, Amsterdam Mayor Reinier Pauw decided to team up with the other states to undermine the Attorney General. Not so much for religious reasons, but for political and economic ones. You see, just as it had been at the beginning of the revolt, the religious fight was wholly intertwined with political and economic issues. Social unrest spread mainly among workers who were Gomarian and southern immigrants who were anti-Arminian. The immigrants from the south had brought new prosperity to the north with their textile industry, but they were still excluded from government, weren't allowed to become militia members, and weren't entitled to poor relief. They paid taxes, but had no representation. Meanwhile, merchants exploited the workers to increase profits. The laborers' salaries dropped while the rents went up, and the same thing happened in the brewing industry. By early 1617, the unmistakable smell of rebellion hung in the air over the Republic. Everywhere mud beggars defiantly marched out of the cities in long columns every Sunday to Contra-Remonstrant churches in the countryside or locally in barns, outhouses and canal boats. It was the hedge sermons all over again. Their defiance threatened the regent's power. The authorities nailed up the barn doors and chased off canal boat congregations, while the population threw rocks at them. Of course, in Gomarian places, the Arminians were driven away, had their barns nailed up and their preachers mobbed. The De Hague mudbeggars were fed up walking to Rijswijk during the winter. They demanded their own church building in their city. Oldenbarnevelt told them they could gather in the great church along with the Arminians. They wouldn't. They couldn't. When the barn they picked for their services was sealed up by the authorities, they gathered at Enoch Mugh's house, Count Maurits' bookkeeper. Once more, the states wanted to get the army to force the people into the churches, but they needed the stadtholder's permission. And once more, he refused, saying, "I've always remained neutral, and I prefer not to get involved in these quarrels." Could he then send his bodyguards or some other soldiers? The Count replied, "The bodyguards are for my protection, and the other soldiers have to defend the border against their enemies and shouldn't be used against their friends." The Gomarians pleaded with their stadtholder for a place to hear the word of God without being forced into churches where they were made to listen to Arminian blasphemy, or at the very least be allowed their barns. Maurits said, surprised, "How? Houses and barns? Are we to preach in barns? The churches belong to us, and we mean to have them too." Maurits believed it was high time that the Contra-Remonstrants had equal rights. On January 13, 1617, Oldenbarnevelt held a meeting with a host of representatives from various levels of government in Holland. The Attorney General asked Stadtholder Maurits to come and share his opinion. Maurits stared Oldenbarnevelt in the eye and simply called for the register books of the states of Holland to be brought out. He turned to the pages which recorded his stadtholderate oath and asked for it to be read out loud. The oath stated they were mutually bound to support the reformed religion till the last drop of blood in their veins. The Count then plainly said, "That oath I will keep, and this religion I will maintain, so long as I live. For this religion my father lost his life, and this religion I will defend." Oldenbarnevelt asked whether he defended the Calvinist Church's stark position that one baby was doomed while another was saved. Maurits shut that down real quick. "Are you a theologian?" "Nope. Me neither. So convene a synod and let them figure it out." After this meeting, Maurits parked his butt on the seat of the Count of Holland in the Great Hall and invited the Contra-Remonstrant leaders to come to him. He promised the mudbeggars their own church, but when granting them the Great Church proved difficult, the Count asked the new English ambassador Dudley Carleton — Winwood had been recalled for being a little too pushy concerning the Arminian heretics — to allow Roseus and his congregation to use the Gasthuiskerk. which at that time was used by the English embassy. Carleton gladly obliged. That would have to do, for now. The French nobles' rebellion definitively ended with the Treaty of Loudun. The Prince of Condé, who was King Louis's successor, until he slept with his wife and produced some heirs, was restored in his honors. Condé got 1.5 million livres, was made head of the Council of State, and trotted around like he owned the place. But Concini was still around, and his power in government increased. He even became the Marquis d'Ancre and Maréchal de France. The Concinis conspired with Queen Regent Maria to get Secretary of State Villeroy fired. They replaced him with Bishop Armand Jean du Plessis, Duc de Richelieu et Fronsac. You may know him as Cardinal Richelieu from the many iterations of the Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, but we're not there yet. Then Condé made the mistake of threatening Concini, and Maria de Medici got her son Louis to arrest the prince. However, a few weeks later, King Louis came of age. He was fed up with his mom and Concini lording over him and ordered the Italians arrested. Captain of the Royal Guards, Nicolas de l'Hôpital, cornered Concino Concini on the bridge to the Louvre. When the Italian cried for help, the captain killed him for resisting arrest. Concini's wife, Leonora, was accused of witchcraft, arrested, beheaded, and her body burned at the stake. Richelieu was fired, Villeroy was reinstated as Secretary of State, and the king exiled his mom and her entourage, including Bishop Richelieu, to Château de Blois. Everyone in the Netherlands rejoiced. The French officers in The Hague even danced for joy in the streets. King Louis, who had done nothing in his life but feed canaries, became a hero overnight. Now stop fooling around with your male courtiers, sleep with your wife and make some babies, man. Civil unrest spiraled out of control all over the country. In Kampen, Remonstrant capital of Overijssel, Arminian skippers refused to transport goods for Gomarian merchants in the city. Those in charge of the government, Oldenbarneveld fans, took no measures against the skippers. Gelderland had the same problem in reverse. In Brabant things got out of hand when fights broke out in Breda between the two camps, so the city council banned anyone from talking about the situation from the pulpit. In Holland, things got dark. In August 1616, working-class contra-remonstrants and their wives looted the town hall in Delft to protest high bread prices and worsening working conditions. In Gouda, contra-remonstrants in the city council wanted to present a petition to the stadtholder to ask permission to start a separate reformed congregation. This made the other council members so mad that they expelled the two leaders of the petition and stripped 3 others of their citizenship so they could no longer be council members. On February 8, 1617, the Den Briel government ordered soldiers to hunt down and apprehend a contra-remonstrant reverend. Count Maurits scolded the captains and officers for doing this without his express orders. Garrisons were under his command, but Oldenbarneveld insisted that the men had simply done their duty. Mudbeggar crowds rioted in Amsterdam. They stormed a warehouse where an Arminian church service was held, shouting, "Kill the preacher!" They destroyed tables and benches, smashed doors and windows, and threw mud and stones at the fleeing remonstrants. It's the iconoclasm all over again. They even tried to drown the preacher in a ditch. At 6 p.m., the sheriff appeared, and the mob dispersed. The Amsterdam government arrested some rascals, but they were released soon after. After all, it was the Remonstrants' fault for having these secret meetings. In Oudewater, Arminius' birthplace, a mob of craftsmen forced the Arminian town council to annul the resignation of Mudbeggar Reverend Johannes Lydius. Count Maurits refused to support the regents with the town's garrison. Then, disaster struck. In June 1617, the stadtholder's favorite son, the 13-year-old Maurits Jr., died of the plague. Apparently, Count Maurits lost it. He arranged a funeral for his bastard son, complete with full honors. This was absolutely not done at the time. Bastard children were supposed to be invisible, but Count Maurits' own halberdiers carried the casket through the streets, followed by various government members, military officials, and the family. Maurits, walking right behind the child's coffin, openly wept. The people who watched the funeral procession pass through the streets of The Hague were in total shock. not only because of the scandal of the whole procedure, but they'd never seen the general this frail before. Count Maurits then dealt the grieving mother of his child a nasty blow. He had a plaque placed above Margarethe's door of her house in The Hague with the heraldry of the House of Nassau, but it had a strike through it to indicate her sons were merely natural-born sons of the family. Bastards. Count Maurits also refused to see poor Margarethe for months. Just a few weeks after the death of his son, Count Maurits made his opening move against Oldenbarneveld in the one game of chess he was determined to win. The Count had allowed the civil servants division to fool around for a while, but now it was time for the grown-ups to take the wheel. And by grown-ups, I mean God-appointed rulers and adjacent. And by adjacent, I mean Count Maurits. The mudbeggars in The Hague considered the English Gasthuis Church too small, and the Gomarians were once more in the market for a new location. They eyed the ancient convent, the Kloosterkerk or the Cloister Church, which was currently used as a cannon foundry and munitions depot. The place was a mess, part monastery, part factory, and part chapel. Oldenbarneveld and the city council were constantly throwing up obstacles, but the mudbeggars refused to wait any longer. On July 3rd, 1617, they rolled up their sleeves and worked to get the place ready for service themselves. Count Maurits personally oversaw the preparations. That following Sunday, Reverend Henricus Roseus preached triumphantly among the pieces of artillery and piles of cannonballs to an enthusiastic congregation. He baptized 3 children with the telling names Willem, Maurits, and Hendrik. On July 16th, the stadtholder attended the service at the great church, as always, but was fuming with rage afterwards. Reverend Uitenboogaard had gleefully and openly preached against the synod. As Maurits left the church with his stepmother Louise de Coligny, he shouted, "He is the enemy of God!" And so, the following Sunday, July 23, 1617, Count Maurits headed up a solemn procession through the streets of The Hague from the stadtholder quarters toward the Cloister Church to attend the service there. He was joined by Count Willem Lodewijk, all the chief officers of his household, and members of staff. But the ever-careful and calculated Maurits had told his brother, Count Frederik Hendrik, to continue to attend Uitenboogaard services in case this thing went sideways. As Maurits' train moved down the streets, a large crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. It looked like an army preparing for a siege, with 2 famous generals heading up the group. 4,000 people joined the Count at that service, while only a few hundred attended the service at the great church. The whole thing was an impressive demonstration meant for an audience of one, Johan van Oldenbarneveld. You see, the Cloister Church was right next door to Oldenbarneveld's house. The Attorney General had witnessed the procession with absolute disgust. If preacher Triggeland is to be believed, Oldenbarneveld exploded in a rage. The Attorney General demanded that the 4 ringleaders of this mutiny be pulled out of bed at midnight and taken to the execution site in the middle of the town to be beheaded. The States would then summon all the citizens at dawn by the ringing of bells and firing of cannons to witness the ghastly spectacle and teach them what this revolt against their authority meant. The intended victims allegedly were Count Maurits' bookkeeper, Enoch Mugg, an attorney, an engraver, and an apothecary. Oldenbarneveld demanded that their heads be delivered to him in a basket. Since Oldenbarneveld's son-in-law, Reinoud van Brederode, Lord of Veenhuizen, was the president of the court, the Attorney General thought he could issue a warrant quickly. But 2 Zeeland members of the States General pulled a Holland councillor out of his sickbed to come and vote against the rule. According to Triggeland, the measure was defeated by a majority of 1. Oldenbarneveld swore that none of this ever happened. Still, Count Maurits had very publicly slapped Oldenbarneveld across the face, and Oldenbarneveld got ready to strike right back.